I've got an interesting program, but it's way too vast for the little time frame that we have tonight. So I thought after kind of having this sort of informal back and forth and discussion, then I would kind of hone in on what we would do. My thought was I was going to do something on cycles of time, the great year, and like Marnie just said, what the implications of that would be for, you know, primarily our future, because this was something that ancient peoples were extremely cognizant of, is, you know, all of the ancient calendars reflect this consciousness of where in the cycles we might find ourselves. And then, of course, there's a lot of discussion, you know, with the upcoming 2012 and the end of the Mayan calendar. We could address that somewhat. I would like to say at the outset, I don't necessarily think that there's anything catastrophic implied in the year 2012. I merely interpret it as a cosmic marker, if you will. There is a very significant alignment that takes place in December of that year. But that alignment is based upon long, slow astronomical cycles, and they're of such a duration that for all practical purposes, we are already in that alignment. And essentially, it's the winter solstice with the center of the galaxy in Sagittarius. But given that the center of the galaxy is not defined with a great deal of precision anyway, and given that the winter solstice is only moving at about 50 seconds of arc per year, for all practical purposes, it's already there. That alignment is already taking place. And whether there would be a catastrophic implication to that or not, I'm very doubtful. That's not to say, though, that catastrophe isn't one of the major elements of understanding the great cycles. And I call myself an unrepentant catastrophist, and I try to you know, engage, you know, people in the professional fields of geology and geophysics and stuff in dialogues about this, and I'm finding that, you know, it's a mixed bag out there. Some geologists are really beginning to wake up and recognize that, for example, traditional peoples actually had a very profound scientific knowledge of the way the world works, and that we can benefit by accessing that knowledge and that wisdom. Others have a more elitist view, and they believe that, you know, it was pre-literate, pre-scientific, superstition, and so forth, and there's not a lot to be gleaned from it. But there's a sort of a new generation of earth scientists that are definitely in tune with more traditional concepts of earth change, and are realizing that when the ancient peoples talked about cycles of catastrophe, they were actually much more accurate than some of the modern geologists who saw everything as a gradual, uniform, linear process. And that has been the dominant paradigm of earth thinking for almost a century. But in the last couple of decades, that paradigm has begun to let go as a dogma in the geological community, although ideas of strict gradualism are still being taught through the academic programs of earth science. I did notice something when I was taking earth science courses in the early 90s, that the textbooks were beginning to address the ideas of catastrophe. 1980 constitutes a very critical year in our understanding about Earth history, because prior to that, the overwhelming dominant paradigm of Earth change was strict uniformity, strict gradualism. In 1980, there were 3 papers, very milestone papers published, that addressed the idea of the interactions between the Earth and the cosmos, and the recognition that some of those interactions had been profoundly catastrophic. And this primarily focused on what is known as the Cretaceous-Tertiary transition, which was, of course, the famous mass extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But with that, and the recognition of the scientific community that there had been at least one great catastrophe in the history of the Earth, it began to open the door to the recognition that the possibility of other catastrophes. But so there was the beginning of a paradigm shift in 1980 about our understanding of the planet that we live on. And it's taken pretty much a full generation for the old paradigm and its entrenched dogmas to finally begin to let go their ironclad hold on our thinking about our planet. And the evolution of it was essentially going from Okay, yes, we recognize that catastrophes have played a role in the history of the Earth, the long-term history of the Earth. But those catastrophes bore no real relationship to the world of humankind and the world of culture and society and civilization that we've created on this planet. And the last decade has seen the next, what I consider the next phase of the evolution of our thinking, which is that catastrophes have played a role in the human story. In fact, the most important role in the human story on planet Earth. And I like to point out to people that, you know, from the scientific standpoint, the oldest modern human remains on Earth that have now been uncovered. Does anybody know roughly the dates? When I say modern human remains, I'm talking about human beings who, if we put flesh on these bones and dressed them up in modern clothes, we wouldn't be able to tell that they weren't just like us. Does anybody know? Not that old, no. I'm talking about the oldest confirmed skeletal remains. 160 to 180,000. 160, 180,000. They've named this human being Homo idaltu. And the only discernible difference between this individual, of the several individuals that have been found, is that their cranial capacity seems to be perhaps 5% larger than average modern, which is interesting because if cranial capacity has anything to do with intelligence, it would imply conservatively that they were at least as intelligent as ourselves. And we look and we have our record of history that begins roughly, you know, with the emergence of Sumeria and Egypt and the Indus Valley civilization around 43 to 4,500 years ago. So if you consider it, that's when the record begins. So we modern humans have been here conservatively 160 to 180,000, and it could be much older than that. Could be much older because this is just the oldest specimens we've found. So this clearly has an implication to it. The implication is that the greater part of human history on this planet is lost. And what we have that constitutes modern recorded history should really be more accurately thought of as the rebooting of human history. And once one begins, and when we have our slideshow after dinner, I'm going to be showing you some graphics and charts and so forth that will spell this all out for you very clearly so you can see these relationships. But the bottom line is that since if we use this date of 160 to 180,000 years, there have been at least 12 catastrophes, which, if a catastrophe of that magnitude were to occur today, it would terminate modern civilization and put us back into the Stone Age. Now this is 12. This is 12 catastrophes that have now been identified within the geological record. And this is in 160,000 years. So we humans have faced some pretty extraordinary times on this planet. And as it turns out, in the last couple of years, new evidence has come to light suggesting that a mere 5,000 years ago, there was a global catastrophe of biblical proportions. And once one recognizes that, it becomes apparent why our historical record is only 4,500 years old. And I'm going to tell you about that catastrophe in our slideshow. I'm going to show you what it was, and I'll show you the evidence for it, how they identified it. And but clearly, when you begin to look at the ancient world, you begin to understand that times have been very different than we have enjoyed today. It turns out that when we begin to look at the climate record of climate change and the environmental record, the record of environmental change, the period since recorded history has begun is one of the most stable periods of 4,000 to 5,000 years within the last 250,000 years, of which we have accurate records. And the last 2 centuries constitutes one of the most stable epochs of climate within the last 5,000 years. And I'm going to show you some of the scientific evidence for that. But what we've gotten from the ancients is this concept of the Great Year. And the Great Year was the model for all of these Earth changes. It basically defined the timing, the tempo of these cycles. And the interesting thing about this, to me, was I had been studying the sacred geometry of space and architecture for many years. And so when you do that, you become familiar with a canon of proportion and a canon of sacred numbers that were found embedded in all of these traditions, the architectural traditions of old. From every continent, we can find the same sacred numerology, the same proportions and the same geometries at work, whether we're talking about Egyptian or Sumerian or megalithic or the great earthworks of North America or the Anasazi culture of the Southwest, the Mayans, the list goes on. There was a similar, if not identical, canon of cosmology at the basis of all of their cultural expressions, primarily expressed through the venue of architecture. But having studied this, I became aware of a series of proportions and sacred numbers that recurred over and over and over again. Well, it soon became clear from further studies and accessing researchers, other researchers that preceded me in all of this, such as Keith Critchlow and John Michel and Robert Lawler and others, that this canon of numbers and proportions had its ultimate origin within nature itself, within the proportions of nature, within the natural world. Well, the evolution of my education about this went from recognizing and working with this canon of number as it related to space, then the recognition that these numbers were also the same numbers that governed the traditional concept of the cycles of time. So that embedded within the cycles and the cycles within the cycles were exactly the same proportions expressed by exactly the same canon of sacred numbers as I had been seeing in the architecture, the sacred architecture of old. And to me, that was just a revelation. That was mind-blowing for me, because to realize that behind the spatial expression, or counterpart to the spatial expression, was a temporal expression, and that behind them both was the implication of a higher type of a reality, of which both space and time were reflections. The canon of sacred proportion, as it's found in the temporal expression, is found in the model of the great year, the cycle which actually has a real, scientifically verifiable astronomical counterpart, and that being what is called the precession of the equinoxes. And that relates directly to what's going to happen, what is happening now with the movement of the winter solstice as it moves towards this, to an alignment with the center of the galaxy. That is the result of the Earth's precessional motion. And this became sort of the great cosmic clock by which traditional peoples all over the ancient world were able to discern the cycles and the cycles within the cycles. Well, the other thing that struck me, because I had several parallel interests. I was interested in the artifacts of man, the art, the architecture, the music, everything that was employed to express the sacred principles. Parallel with that, I was also interested in the world I lived in, the natural world, the environment, the geological changes, and so forth. And it was almost as if they were, parallel interests running side by side that didn't have a lot of overlap. Well, once I made this connection with the temporal cycles, with the precession of the equinoxes in the great year, I began to take a deeper look at what geologists and earth scientists had actually been saying about the earth and earth changes, and lo and behold, there it was. I began to examine the literature of, the transition of the great geological epochs and ages that geologists had discerned in the record of the rocks and the fossils, going back even to the 19th century. They had developed a whole chronology of world history, and it was based upon eons and periods and epochs, and I began to look at those, and lo and behold, there it was. And they had defined these same cycles without any reference at all to the traditional understanding, but there it was. Within the last, say, 20 years, last quarter of a century, there have been high-resolution records of Earth change that have become available to us from deep-sea coring, from ice coring on Greenland and Antarctica, from studies of speleothems and caves. There's many, many different avenues of information that have come to show that there have been a cycle of environmental change, a cycle of climate change that's been ongoing. And sure enough, it actually now reflects what the ancients were defining and describing 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And of course, probably everybody in here is aware of the fact that most of these ancient structures, the infrastructure of the ancient world, the archaic world, was not only geometric, it was also astronomical. And once you begin to study that, you cannot avoid the realization that the designers and builders of these structures were obsessed with the cosmos, and were trying to direct the attention of anybody who was involved with their creations, trying to direct their focus and intention onto this higher domain of the cosmos. Because once you do that, then you realize that the cycles are unfolding on the cosmic level, and they have their echoes through the hierarchy of planes of being, and they finally manifest here in our world. And they devised a system which they devised a method of understanding which, to use modern vernacular, is described would be scale invariance, or fractal self-similarity is an idea that kind of describes the same principle. And that is that there are cycles within the cycles, lesser cycles within the greater cycles, and the greater cycles are outside our normal purview of consciousness on a day-to-day or even a year-to-year basis. However, the greater cycles are reflected in the lesser cycles that are accessible to us. And we're talking here now about things as mundane as the turning of the Earth on its axis, the revolving of the moon about the Earth, the revolving of the Earth about the sun. There is a whole system of harmonic proportion that is set up by those cycles, and they fold over directly into greater cycles. And we discover, in fact, that the precessional cycle, the great year, which is measured at roughly 26,000 years, is a subcycle of yet greater cycles that take us up to the galactic level. And we discover actually that there's a galactic component governing the unfolding and evolution of life on Earth. And so I'm very much about trying to merge the modern consciousness, which has emerged out of our scientific understanding of the world, with the traditional or sacred, the archaic consciousness of the world, because the two are perfectly complementary to one another. And in fact, what I find very auspicious is this. The archaic tradition, large parts of it have been lost to the record. There are gaps through just the attrition of the ages, through deliberate suppression, and so forth. Now you turn to the discoveries of modern science, and they have been describing changes in the history of the world, natural changes, changes in the environment. And interestingly, there are significant gaps within our modern understanding. But when you take the traditional, the archaic worldview and the modern scientific worldview and put them side by side, what you realize is that they fit together perfectly, such that the modern scientific discoveries are filling the gaps, the lost pieces of the archaic vision of the world, and vice versa. So what that implies to me is one of the major tasks before us as we strive to become a successful species on this planet is merging these two worldviews together. And I think if we do that, if we succeed in that, my expectations of optimism will increase considerably.